global total, the global population, right? And that's an extremely important point because, as he points out, economies are not isolated in nation states. In a lot of ways, the reason this is done is that data are collected that way, right? Population data are the result of censuses. Censuses are almost always nation-state based. And to that extent, that's how the data turns out. And it's easy to use data like that. It's also definitely worth, perhaps the more egregious assumption built into the theory of the demographic transition is that what happened in Europe between 1800 and the present is the model. And that model is then extended to the rest of the world. And the demographic transition is treated as something that simply happens. And that as it has happened in Europe in the past 200 years, and it has happened in other places as well, we can therefore expect it to happen everywhere. We can expect the same pattern to play out in parts of the world where this transition is not yet complete, right? And there is the possibility that something else might eventuate, right? This is all those projections about world population stabilizing at 9.2 or 10 billion people in 2050, those projections are all based on the idea that the demographic transition will happen everywhere. And that we will eventually arrive at a point where population is stable because the transition will have happened everywhere, so to speak, right? So here, a graph, the strategic space of growth for 17 European countries, 19th through 20th century. And you are essentially charting life expectancy at birth against total fertility, such that there are various places in this graph where you would have different rates of growth of population. 0% here running through the middle. You can have negative population here, population growth, 1%, 2%, 3%, that sort of thing. The old regime, sort of pre-1900, or pre-1800, I'm sorry, for these countries, tends to be up here, where you have very low life expectancy on the order of 25, 30 years, and very high fertility, 4.5 to 6.5 children per woman. Over time, here's 1870, 1900, you see it creeps up in terms of rate, but then declines, and it's declining by moving downward and to the right, which is to say longer and longer life expectancies and lower total fertility rates. And eventually you arrive at a situation where, in 1980, most of these countries have very slow or even negative rates of population growth. In the meantime, there were these periods between 1870 and 1900 when rates of population growth approached 2%. This is his model for the demographic transition, in which you have a birth rate that remains high, even as the death rate has started to decline, with the result that population increases. At some point, the birth rate begins to decline as well. And you see, even as life expectancy continues to increase, the death rate continues to drop. You see a decline in population due to this decline in the birth rate. So here's the beginning. Here's the middle point where you see the greatest rate of population growth because you've seen declining mortality but not declining fertility. And here's the end. Now, you could end up with wildly different outcomes in terms of overall population growth by the time you're at the end of this, right? You're going to end up at a rate of growth of roughly 0. But in between, you're going to have had this period of accelerated population growth, and it will be a function of how long it took for fertility to decline after mortality began to decline. And so the transition multiplier is a very simple idea. It simply is the ratio of the population at the end of the transition to the population at the beginning of the transition. You could have twice as many people, or you could have 3 times as many people, or you could have 7 or 8 times as many people, depending on the timing of these different moments in the transition, right? And he provides, actually there is a separate table. There's a table in the book that provides these transition multipliers for a number of countries. And it turns out that a lot of European countries and the United States, that multiplier is on the order of 2 or 3, whereas for a lot of countries in the developing world, that multiplier is already significantly higher. For Mexico, it's in the ballpark of 7, right? How does mortality come down? What are the factors that affect declining mortality? If you look at it empirically, it's very much about disease, okay? This is England between 1871 and 1951, Italy between 1881 and 1951, and it's giving you a breakdown of which factors contributed the most to increasing life expectancy. And if you look at them, 43%, 40% attributable to greater control of infectious diseases, greater ability to prevent deaths associated with infectious diseases. Another 13, 14% due to respiratory illnesses. Diarrhea and enteritis, 7, 10%. That's very tightly linked to water quality, right? Being able to supply a population with a healthy, clean water supply dramatically reduces deaths from what we think of as very simple diseases, but which have significant effects on life expectancy in many parts of the world even today, right? There are a variety of other things, but the end point of this is that in the space of 80 or 70 years, life expectancy increased by 27 years in Great Britain and 31 years in Italy due to these contributing factors. Are there questions about those? So it's tempting to say that as countries grow more affluent, as England and Italy both did during this period of time, that mortality declines and life expectancy increases. But it's worth pointing out that that relationship is not linear. Or it's not, you can't just expect life expectancy to keep increasing indefinitely with rising wealth and prosperity. And that's what this graph shows. The relationship between GDP per capita, gross domestic product, and life expectancy for 16 countries at 4 points in time. In 1870, you see short life expectancy and much smaller GDP. And as GDP grows, you see significant gains in life expectancy, as was depicted in that last table. However, in the period 1950 to 2000, you see a near tripling, quadrupling in some cases of GDP per capita, and only a very modest increase, maybe 10 years, in life expectancy. So, as he says, beyond a certain limit, the availability of goods has virtually no influence on survival. Once you've got enough money to pay for your basic needs and medicine, that sort of thing, continuing to get rich does not buy you eternal life. Sorry if that's a disappointing lesson, but so it goes. Step 2, declining fertility. How does fertility come down? This is a somewhat awkward or complicated diagram figure. It perhaps is not worth trying to tease apart all of it here, except to suggest that there is a relationship between affluence and fertility. Fertility does eventually come down. Now, God, do I want to try to begin to explain this? Relationship between general fertility, legitimate fertility, and proportion married in 16 European countries at 4 points in time. No, I'm not even trying to explain. The take-home point is that fertility declines. Okay? General fertility is measured against an average in a given country, right? And so you expect it to be 1. I guess they hold that constant. And eventually, over time, the number of births in this index, in which 1 is the maximum and 0 would be no children, you start to see fewer and fewer births per woman. I'm sorry, you have a question?
Is it related to household size and how household size goes down when we're more prosperous? Because I never understood exactly why, when in America, we have more household numbers, but smaller household sizes because we're more affluent. Maybe that was the reason.
Okay, is it related to the decline in household size in terms of people per household? Clearly, yes. I mean, if the average woman has only 2 children instead of 7, you're likely to see smaller households, right? On the other hand, there are other factors that can intervene in terms of, well, how much of the extended family lives in a given household, and that is another factor that will affect household size. Both could be said to correlate with affluence. I suppose it's empirically the case that more affluent societies start to see, the nuclear family more likely to live on its own without grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles and that sort of thing. I guess that's not necessarily what Libbey-Bachie is trying to address right here, but I think you're right to bring up that relationship.
So was there a reason why affluence?
Why does affluence decrease household size? Well, we're going to talk about the factors that bring down fertility, but we're not going to talk about why affluence leads you to throw your grandparents out. Although I suppose there are a lot of people in the world, if they can afford to have their grandparents live someplace else, they probably prefer it that way. But that's unfortunate too, right?
Do you have less children when you have more money?
Generally speaking, the folks in the world who have more money have fewer children, and that's what we're talking about.
Do you know why?
We're going to talk about why. Yeah.
Then when you bring up with the 2050 projection,
Mhm.
population will stabilize, then it pretty much assumes that a significant portion of the world, almost all the world, will have achieved at least a modest point of affluence.
Good question. Does the demographic transition do these world population projections for 2050 assume that everyone in the world will have achieved a certain level of affluence? In one sense, yes. Insofar as affluence is a key component of the theory of the demographic transition, right? And I think actually a lot of people in the development community, the World Bank, for instance, would in fact say, yes, what we're hoping for is a decline in fertility, subsequent to an increase in prosperity. However, there have been, and in some places continue to be, alternative mechanisms in people's minds, according to which whether or not affluence increases, and whether or not we see prosperity growing, we will bring down fertility anyway. And when we get to the book Fatal Misconception, we'll read about examples where this strategy was pursued quite aggressively in many parts of the world. The idea that we could bring fertility down regardless of what the general level of affluence or prosperity was in a given place.
But then you would still have a mortality question.
The mortality question is...
Even if fertility decreased, you could still have high mortality if you didn't have a certain level of affluence for it.
Right. Well, and actually one of the things that is interesting about the demographic transition is that it actually has begun, so to speak, in a lot of parts of the world that are poor. We actually have seen increasing life expectancy without what we would consider to be modern development taking place, right? And that's the way you sort of deal with the fact, and this is actually the next chapter in Libbey-Bachie, so we're not talking about it quite yet, but what has happened in poorer parts of the world, we have seen tremendous increases in population that are attributable in large measure to declining mortality. What brings fertility down? Remember we saw that we had those boxes, those grids of 16 boxes, and you could imagine different factors that affect fertility. If 16 is sort of the theoretical maximum number of children per woman that could exist in a given setting, and we broke it down, Libbey-Bachie broke it down into different things, age at marriage, that kind of thing, and we discovered that age at marriage is, a significant way, more significant than most of the others, as far as factors to reduce fertility. However, the real factor that most significantly brings down fertility is contraception. Simple as that. The availability of an efficient means of fertility control rendered the nuptial check superfluous. This is the distribution by decade of number of provinces of Europe experiencing 10% decline in legitimate fertility. This is taken by Libbey-Bachie as a sort of key moment, some kind of watershed, and this is at the province level, so it's not nation state. You can track births in provinces, and when you see a 10% decline in the rate of fertility, and you see it stick, it stays, it doesn't reverse itself, you can assume, according to Libbey-Bachie, that that is roughly when contraception became widely available to the women in the area. And you see that there was a little bit of this around 1800, beginning in France. It was initially limited to the well-to-do, the affluent. By the latter part of the 19th century, it became more widespread. And by 1900, you see an incredible peak in essentially the availability of contraception in Europe. And if you go back and look at those 16 box diagrams, those figures earlier, it's actually there too. By far, the simplest or most significant contributing factor to reduced fertility is birth control. Yeah.
Why did it go down faster?
Because by that point, most of the provinces had made this switch. Excuse me? Oh yeah, no, contraception continues to be available. This is just the moment at which these provinces experienced a dip that didn't reverse itself, a falling off of fertility that remained in place, which is to say contraception remained available. Now, this is not to reduce everything to contraception, and that's in many ways the lesson of the Connolly book, Fatal Misconception, is that it's not as simple as simply saying, let's get all the women in the world to use birth control. There are a lot of factors that condition whether that's possible, and it makes a big difference whether it's chosen freely by the women or whether it's pushed on them in some fashion. And we'll talk about that later in the semester. The relationship between fertility and income is not direct. That's sort of another way of putting what I just said. It's not simply a question, even if you grant that affluence leads to declining fertility, there are a lot of other factors involved, and you don't necessarily see it immediately, and you don't necessarily see the same pattern everywhere. Here again, 4 different points in time, 1870, 1913, 1950, and 2000. Real GDP per capita on the x-axis, children per women on the y-axis. Yes, there's obviously a relationship in which fertility has come down over time, and it relates to income. Out here, it begins to look nice and tight. But here you see there's quite a bit of scatter in these data points, and it's not insignificant if the scatter is between 2 and 4, right? As a fertility rate, that's a huge difference in terms of how that's going to affect population. Here, it's a difference between 2 and 5.5. For the squares, it's between 3.5 and 7. So there's a lot of potential variability within the relationship. It's not like once you get to $5,000 per capita per year of GDP, you're guaranteed to have a fertility rate of 2. There's a lot of spread. I suppose you could say that by the time you get to 15,000, you're going to see 2 or less. That would be supported by these data. So we're getting close to the end here. What have I got? 4 minutes. Ooh, all right. Final points that need to be stressed for these chapters from Libbey-Bachie. The importance of industrialization. Job losses in agriculture must be compensated elsewhere. And these are data for 10 countries in Europe, looking at the ratio of those employed in manufacturing to those engaged in agriculture. So that's this ratio. The higher you are, the more industrial jobs there are in relation to agricultural jobs over time in different countries. And you see that different countries industrialize at different points in time. And basically, this is Marx's argument playing itself out. As agriculture modernizes, you have more and more people available to work in something other than agriculture. And those people need to find jobs. And the question is, are those jobs available right there in the same country, in industry, or not? And he's going to emphasize, for instance, Libby Bacci emphasizes that the fact that Italy industrialized more slowly and the United Kingdom more quickly earlier meant that in the UK there were jobs available for people as agricultural employment declined. In Italy, it was not the case. And as a result, you saw millions of Italians migrate to the United States, right? Now, granted, a lot of Brits migrate to the United States as well. But the question is there, as you make part of this transition, in effect, is from an agriculturally based economy to an industrially based economy. And if there is a lag, you are going to see imbalances that can have significant effects on things like migration, okay? Between 1820 and 2000, the population of 4 leading Western nations, Great Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, grew by a factor of 5.4, while their combined GDP in constant prices multiplied by about 100. Per capita production then increased 19-fold. So here we have perhaps the extreme example of Malthus doesn't make sense of this picture, right? You see an increase in population, but it is almost trivial compared to the increase in economic production. If there were any kind of resource scarcity entrained by population growth, this seems to be quite the opposite. You see a situation of population growth that appears to be correlates, in time anyway, with a remarkable increase in production. And this is essentially industrialization at work. You can have more and more goods per person, even as you have more and more people. And again, it's worth stressing that this is done on a nation-state basis, and it doesn't address questions of, okay, where are all these resources coming from? Are they coming from outside or not? That kind of thing. The long-term experience of wealthy nations whose populations grow at different rates does not allow us to attribute a particular economic role to demographic growth. This relationship is complicated by the interfering effects of other phenomena. Population and economy are at the same time dependent and independent variables. And this is perhaps the simplest way of saying there is no simple set relationship between population growth and economic growth. It's too complicated to reduce it to some nice, clean rule of thumb that population growth either does or doesn't lead to poverty or prosperity. I'll leave you with this. This is the graph, changes in increase in population and GNP, total and per capita in the United States. We'll pick this up next time. Take a look at it, see what you think, how to interpret it.